taxpayers are paying too much to get a pot of money. For instance, in Poway, they're going to pay $1 billion to come up with $100 million. So once they sell the bonds, they get that pot of $100 million. I contend that the taxpayers are being harmed on the second part of that, which is when they go to spend that $100 million, when they do so without using competitive bidding, they are not assured that that $100 million is going as far as possible. And my contention is, if you are overpaying for your school construction by 10, 20, or 30%, that means over the life of your bond program, you're getting 10, 20, or 30% less facilities than you could have. Again, that's a bit of a policy decision. So, Mr. Gordon.
Yes.
And you're going to have to speak loud because
Okay, well, my question is, a lot of your comments suggest or imply that there is a lack of good faith spending of money. The only objective study that I'm aware of is an April 2011 study by the San Diego County Taxpayers Association. Have you seen that study?
no.
Okay. The study reported that it looked at lease-back, CM multi-prime, and design bid build. And it looked at projects in San Diego County. And the result of that study showed that lease-back delivery resulted in the greatest savings over original budget, the most on-time delivery, and the slowest rate of change orders. So design bid build, for example, and the projects they looked at had a 66.7% on-time rate compared to 100% for design build. My question is, other than speculation, is there any hard and fast evidence that you're aware of, any studies that have been done that suggest that lease-back is not providing the most effective delivery?
Thank you. And my esteemed opposing counsel, Mr. Thornton. Thank you. And actually, I mean, sincerely, Jason Thornton and the school district's attorney, Martin Hahn, I have the highest respect for both of them. I've known both of those attorneys for over 15 years. We all do construction litigation. And they're fine gentlemen, and they're zealously advocating for their clients. And it's been a pleasure to litigate with them over the last 9 months. In my career as an attorney, I'm serious, in my career as an attorney for 16 years, I can't say that about all of my opposing counsel. So I mean that in the highest sense of the compliment. Now, with regard to your question, earlier today I think we heard some comments about how in today's bidding environment, bids are coming in at 20%, 30%, 40% below the engineer's estimates. And I believe that there's a study out of the Central California Builders Exchange that's been tracking engineers' estimates versus the hard bids that come in. And that's the only anecdotal evidence I have to respond to your question as far as whether or not you're getting the best price. But why would it hurt if you have DSA-approved plans and specifications, which you have to have before you do a lease-back transaction? Why not go through the process of competitively bidding that? Because then you would get, in the market, generals and subcontractors working together, economies of scale, and they would give you a price. And then you could go to your lease-back contractor and say, will you match this price? But right now, that's not being done. So my concern is, so the way that lease-back contractors are being selected is by a quote-unquote competitive review process, whereby they all submit their statement of qualifications, and they look at the plans and specifications as they exist at the time of the proposals, and they give what's called a guaranteed maximum price. They say, we don't think it's going to cost more than this. And then someone is selected, not necessarily based upon low price, and then the project is executed. And lo and behold, usually it comes out right at budget. Like the school district, what did you plan to spend on this? Guess what? That's exactly what you spent on that. And so I would assert that if true competitive sealed bidding were used, you would have instances where you would be coming in significantly under what the estimated values are. Also includes, so that was this is my letter to the San Diego County Taxpayers Association, bringing to their attention what I believe to be the other side of the coin to CABS is the non-competitively bid lease backs. And then also included in your materials are a couple of newspaper articles from Southern California. One was by Will Carlos, who did a follow-on story about the Poway bonds. He basically picked up where Joe Thurtell, who was going to speak after me, left off with regard to how the process works. And he found a significant correlation between people who donate to the bond campaign and people who get the contracts. With regard to the financiers, these are all the people that are putting together the bond sales, and basically he tracked it along and said, okay, if you made a contribution at a certain date, then subsequent to that, they were hired to underwrite a bond. Similarly, he did a similar analysis with regard to construction contracts. And lo and behold, there was a definite correlation between those contractors that contributed to bond passage campaigns as being recipients of bond projects without competitive bidding. Then, sure.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt it. Still trying to understand this. So if you've got a lease back, and you now obligate, I don't know, what's the average term of a lease back?
Interesting. In the 1950s, and I think as contemplated by the legislature, it was supposed to be not more than 40 years.
Now what are they currently?
They are equal to the duration of construction. And the rent payments are proportionate to the amount of the pay application on a monthly basis. So there's no fixed rent. There may be a 14-month construction project, so you have 14 sublease payments. And those 14 sublease payments just happen to coincidentally track with whatever the value of construction put in place during that predecessor period was.
So you're paying. So it's only being paid off over. So these are pretty much short terms.
Because they're not being financed, they're not a true financing vehicle. They're simply they're using cash on hand from bond sales to pay for. Yeah.
So you're using bond sales, not necessarily. Typically, when you have bonds, you're taking the taxes to pay off those bonds, to pay off the interest and principal. You're not using interest and principal. You're not using that tax money to pay off 20 years of lease payments, but rather you're using actual bond revenue. Okay.
Correct. And so it's essentially the same as a typical design bid build pay schedule, if you will, with pay applications. It's just that by calling it a lease back and asserting the legal arguments that they're asserting, they can say we can award this without competitive bidding and we can give it to whoever we want.
Kevin? Under Government Code 4217, you're allowed to do non-competitive bidding for energy projects with ESCOs, so long as there were a couple of different parts. One is that the contractor, the ESCO contractor, had to provide or arrange the financing for the project, and number two, the amount of savings had to equal or exceed the debt service. Full disclosure, my company has done 4217s before on a non-competitive basis where they were cash flow neutral or better, but we always had to, one of the key provisions of getting that was that we had to arrange the financing. That seems to be the intent of lease-back. If you take that out, are you allowed to retain the non-competitive bidding part?
I contend not, and that's the crux of we have 3 legal challenges pending right now: Fresno, Torrance, and Long Beach. And that will be a question to be answered by the Superior Court, and I'm confident that no matter which side wins, it will be a question that then goes up to the Court of Appeal, because it is a question of the legal, statutory interpretation is a question of law. There are some questions of fact as far as whether or not these are true leases or not. So I'm getting a couple of questions. Could you hold your questions? Let's get through the rest of our presentation.
That's just one question really to Michael. given that you're an advocate for one side, and I thought this would be more pros and cons, and we have somebody who's on.
You made a contribution at a certain date, then subsequent to that, they were hired to underwrite a bond. Similarly, we did a similar analysis with regard to construction contracts. And lo and behold, there was a definite correlation between those contractors that contributed to bond passage campaigns and as being recipients of bond projects without competitive bidding. Then, I'm sure.
So I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Still trying to understand this. So if you've got a lease back, and you now obligate, I don't know, what's the average term of a lease back?
Interesting. In the 1950s, and I think as contemplated by the legislature, it was supposed to be not more than 40 years.
Now what are they currently?
They are equal to the duration of construction. And the rent payments are proportionate to the amount of the pay application on a monthly basis. So there's no fixed rent. There may be a 14-month construction project, so you have 14 sublease payments, and those 14 sublease payments just happen to coincidentally track with whatever the value of construction put in place during that predecessor period was.
And so you're paying, so it's only being paid off over, so these are pretty much short terms?
Because they're not being financed, they're not a true financing vehicle. They're simply, they're using cash on hand from bond sales to pay for, yeah.
So you're using bond sales, not necessarily, typically when you have bonds, you're taking the taxes to pay off those bonds, to pay off the interest and principal. You're not using interest and principal, you're not using that tax money to pay off 20 years of lease payments, but rather you're using actual bond revenue. Okay.
Correct, and so it's essentially the same as a typical design bid build pay schedule, if you will, with pay applications. It's just that by calling it a lease back and asserting the legal arguments that they're asserting, they can say we can award this without competitive bidding, we can give it to whoever we want.
Kevin? Under Government Code 4217, you're allowed to do non-competitive bidding for energy projects with ESCOs, so long as there were a couple of different parts. One is that the contractor, the ESCO contractor, had to provide or arrange the financing for the project, and number two, the amount of savings had to equal or exceed the debt service. Full disclosure, my company has done 4217s before on a non-competitive basis where they were cash flow neutral or better. But we always had to, one of the key provisions of getting that was that we had to arrange the financing. That seems to be the intent of lease-back. If you take that out, are you allowed to retain the non-competitive bidding part?
I contend not, and that's the crux of we have 3 legal challenges pending right now: Fresno, Torrance, and Long Beach. And that will be a question to be answered by the Superior Court, and I'm confident that no matter which side wins, it will be a question that then goes up to the Court of Appeal, because it is a question of the legal, statutory interpretation is a question of law. There are some questions of fact as far as whether or not these are true leases or not. So, I'm getting a couple of questions. Could you hold your questions? Let's get through the rest of our presentation.
Can I ask just one question for Michael? Given that you're an advocate for one side, and I thought this would be more pros and cons, and we have somebody who's been active on the other side, can we take 3 or 4 minutes to have that gentleman come up and, because I was expecting pros and balance.
Right.
And you're clearly an advocate on one side for an hour, and is that possible?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd say consent of the room. Does that seem like a good
No.
idea?
No, that's not good.
Okay, never mind.
Sorry, guys.
Moving on. Included in your materials there as Exhibit B, you'll notice that I unfortunately made the mistake of double labeling some of my exhibits as Exhibit A and Exhibit A. So disregard the center exhibit and go to the right corner Exhibit B is another article, and it talks about, I'm sorry, maybe Exhibit B is the same Will Carlos article, and it talked about how the underwriter for the Poway bond, the infamous Poway bond, had donated more than $5,000. I'm sorry, no. So school bond underwriting across San Diego County has been dominated by 6 firms since 2006. In that time, those companies who have donated $280,000 to bond campaigns. That is to get the voters to approve the bond. Almost every time an underwriter donated more than $5,000, it won the lucrative contract to underwrite that district's bonds. Remember, that was the Piper Jaffray graphic that I showed you. In 2011, the underwriters Stone and Youngberg netted $813,000 for underwriting the Poway District's now famous billion-dollar bond. And so again, the bond underwriters have an economic incentive to get these bonds passed by the electorate. And the contractors have an incentive to get these bond measures passed by the electorate. And I contend, Carlos quoted me in his article, and basically I said that anytime you introduce the possibility to deviate from the lowest sealed bid, you introduce the opportunity for influence, favoritism, and just those two alone. Let's just say influence and favoritism. I'm not going to say there's any necessarily bad conduct, but just favoritism alone. You're basically limiting your pool of prospective contractors. Therefore, you're potentially limiting the savings that you could have through competitive bidding. Now, let's say that there's a little bit more nefarious conduct. You could have fraud, or you could even have corruption. And so that's really sort of what sparked my interest in this was, in my neighborhood, in my community down in San Diego, we have what's called South Bay. And currently in South Bay, there are 15 elected officials or contractors that are under indictment for various allegations. And mind you, these are allegations only. Remember, we're all presumed innocent until proven guilty. And so I'm not suggesting that anyone is guilty, and I'm not suggesting that anyone has done anything. But I am also suggesting in the articles that I'm providing you that there is evidence out in the record that would call into question the moral, I'm not going to say legal, I'm going to say moral appropriateness of some of the conduct that's been engaged in. And so, for instance, under Exhibit D, it came out in a deposition. This was a civil deposition between a contractor and the San Ysidro Unified School District. The superintendent of the San Ysidro Unified School District was under oath in deposition, and he was asked about a bag of $2,500 in cash that he received from a contractor in the seat of a car, in a restaurant, something like that. This is a picture of the restaurant where it happened. And his answer was, well, that was a campaign contribution. Okay, maybe it was. And maybe it was. I'm not suggesting, I certainly do not want to impinge upon anyone's First Amendment constitutional rights to make campaign contributions. They're free to contribute to whoever they want. What I'm suggesting is that we should then have and implement our construction programs in a way that doesn't allow those campaign contributions to influence who is ultimately awarded the contract. We shouldn't allow East Coast type of contracting. Then the last two articles, I think I'm out of time, this is a current summary of the 15 folks that are have been indicted and how that is progressing. So with that, I have a few minutes for questions and we'll wrap up. Yes.
So two things. Your opposing counsel made a very clever question, but I'm not sure. I think it missed the point, right? Even if lease-leaseback gives us enormous advantages, if it always saves money, if it always makes us be on time, if it always reduces change orders, your contention is the process most people are using violates the law. So it doesn't really matter to me how great it is in some instances or all the time. If you're right? If it does violate the law, then let's fix that, right? Let's start doing it right. And if there really is all these advantages, then we'll have the legislature change the law so that we can make use of this wonderful process, right? But your contention, I think, right, is that we're not in that situation. So maybe you have something to say to that, but then my other question, much less controversial, when the state architect has to approve these plans for schools, is there any mechanism for public comment into that process for the, an individual in a given district to say, hey, I think these plans are garbage? Do you know about that?
No, I'm not aware of any opportunity for public comment into the development of the plans and specifications. Certainly you could attempt to engage in your local district in that process if you have a distinct interest in it. I suspect that your efforts would be welcome. But it is a, kind of a long, drawn-out process. Yes?
Lease-back, one of the primary rationales for it is from a staff perspective, is you don't end up like the contractors on projects. Ones that are easy to work with, that have demonstrated experience to perform on time. Has there been any discussion about, and this is done at least in county government, where you have a pre-qualification for a major project, that they have to be X through A or A through B, F, that they have to meet certain criteria, major contractors, and they need all that criteria, then have those 5 contractors, whatever it may be, then do the lowest bid on those 5 contracts. So you get the best of both worlds. You eliminate the flaky contractors, and you get the lowest responsible bid. Does anybody suggest that maybe that's the way to go?
I'm not aware of that being implemented per se. I'm just not personally aware of that. But certainly a school district would be free to, the statutes are simply a minimum floor that would govern what you at least have to do. But certainly public agencies are free to do more with regard to the scrutiny and the screening, so long as they do not violate the requirements that it be open to all. So there are certain statutes that do allow for pre-qualification for public contractors. And so long as those statutes were followed, then I presume that the school district could choose to do that.
All right, I think we got time for, we'll go with 2 more questions. Center of the room.
Yes. One thing is if you're planning to try to reform or change the alternative procurement authorizations and law, about the only ally you have right now lobbying the legislature is the professional engineers in the California government who have their own agenda. One thing, though, that I think could be changed in the various alternative procurement authorizations, and this has been done in the county one only, is I learned over the years that in these cases it's often very difficult to get basic information through Public Records Act requests about what's going on, because it turns into this sort of ambiguous public-private type operation. And when you request even something like certified payroll records or other records, they say, oh, that's the property of the contractor. You can't give that to you. And the contractor says trade secrets, and you can't get it. And you probably know about the San Diego Convention Center expansion, where the people had to file a lawsuit in order to get some basic documents about what was going on there. I think that I tell people who are supportive of design build, I said, you got a great thing going here, but don't blow it by keeping everything secret. Those laws have to be overhauled to allow much more public access, so that when something does go wrong, it's found quickly and solved. I think that the supporters of design build are making a big strategic mistake by trying to keep everything secret about what they do. So my point is, I think that you need to get together perhaps with the professional engineers in California government and say, a step in the right direction on this might be sticking in some provisions that are already in the county bill saying what you can get as public records, so that rather than stretching these things out over years, people can find out right away and there'll be transparency and openness. It might discourage some of the claims that you're making about illegal activity. It's just too secretive right now.
Thank you.
Oh, very close to actually being a question. And then for our final thing that's allegedly supposed to be a question,
Yes.
we turn over here.
I was just wondering, you outlined the process where where a school board is supposed to have a resolution saying they intend to enter into a lease-back and when they're going to open the bids. What if a school board never does that and they just bring the contract to the school board already with the bid saying, oh gosh, only one person gave us a bid and it's, 30% over what our engineer's estimate was, but hey, we better do it because otherwise we're gonna have to have interim housing and, it's gonna go into the following year. So does that mean that they've already violated the law by not doing that initial resolution?
Well, again, that would be my legal assertion, and it's sort of created by the ambiguity of having 406 say what it says and 417 say what it says, and as the gentleman astutely recognized, that they sort of have the cart before the horse. But my jaded experience, and I suspect it might be some of yours as well, and I heard someone else make a comment on very similar lines, which is, yeah, running a stop sign is illegal, but if the policeman's not there to see you and do something about it, it happens. And so that's been my experience also is, it requires vigilance and action in order to ensure that these basic public policies and requirements are followed. Thank you.
All right. We have a CALBOC with your name on it. Here, I'll even hold it up so the official CALBOC name.